This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News 9, English news as it should be.
Hello and welcome to this very special edition. We are at the beginning of 2026, and first up, here's wishing all our viewers of News 9 a very happy new year. Well, like I said, 2026 is here. The calendar has changed, but the world we've stepped into today was built day by day over the last 12 months. The choices we made in 2025 are already shaping the risks, the alliances, the markets, and the conflicts we carry into 2026 as well. So, on this special edition, we are not predicting the future, we are reading the calendar that created it, month by month, date by date, and event by event. All the way from Washington to Beijing, from trade wars to shooting wars, from market crashes to market highs, from political comebacks to technological breakthroughs. So, 25 stories that define the year 2025. Three very special guests join us with their views on how the world changed in 2025, one event at a time. Let me welcome the guests joining us: Barnik Chitran Maitra, PE investor, managing partner, Chrysalis Equity Ventures, and Dr. Srinath, policy researcher, corporate advisor. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And of course, we also have with us Mitali, Nikore founder and chief economist, Nikore Associates. Mitali, warm welcome to you. So let's get the ball rolling, should we, into 2026. And we thought, let's actually use the calendar as a prop, as a sort of tool to help us rewind and recollect how our world has changed in 2025. So let's take it sequentially. Let's start from the month of Jan 2025. And oh my God, that one calendar date, Jan 20th, that's when US President Donald Trump was inaugurated as the US president who assumed the Oval Office for the second term. And that 20th Jan led to a lot that 2025 had to offer. So let's get the ball rolling. First with you, Mitali, and just help us sort of, understand. We knew that the world is going to change. We knew in November that Donald Trump is going to come to office. A lot of us believed that Donald Trump coming to office would mean a pro-India US administration. Prime Minister Modi was among the first few, in fact, if not the first major global country leader to visit US President Donald Trump. And the idea was that India is going to be among the first few countries, if not the very first country, to stitch that trade deal with the US. And guess what? 2025 has elapsed, but the trade deal is nowhere on the horizon still.
Absolutely, Kartik. I think, I remember when we all had gathered on your show and we were having this discussion literally on the 19th of Jan,
Yes.
then again on the 20th, then again on the 21st, and everybody was, watching the results very closely. Then we were looking at the swearing in, and, a lot of discussion was going on. The Prime Minister, soon after the swearing in, actually went to the US and had a in-person meeting with
Yep.
President Trump.
Yep.
And at that time, they had that announcement.
Yes. And I think it was pretty clear, Mitali, at that time that it's going to be India which is going to be the front runner in stitching that trade deal with the US. But Barnik, that trade deal has not come through. However, there were some promises, some commitments made. The first tranche of the bilateral trade agreement was to be delivered by the fall of 2025. Winter of 2025 is also over. We are into 2026. But that trade deal continues to be elusive. Are you hopeful that March, at least end of the financial year, if not the end of the calendar year, is when we could potentially see that trade deal coming through?
So I think from a trade deal point of view, the deal, as per my sources, has already got stitched and agreed with. The challenge is actually the Russia-Ukraine war, and the hyphenation of the Indian trade deal with the Russian oil is the big complication in the midst. So while Trump does not solve the Russia-Ukraine war, I think the likelihood of an India trade deal is quite limited. The big change after Trump comes in is the change of US stance from a strategic stance towards a more transactional stance. Let's be clear that it's not a change of US following different allies or them supporting completely different people. I think the change in the tenor of the relationship is completely similar to Trumponomics or Trump politics. It's very transactional, it is very deal by deal, and it is not strategic. So till we can be of strategic importance or we can be of transactional importance to the president, we'll be great friends. When we can't be, we won't be great friends. I think that's what we are seeing. So I'm not very hopeful of a trade deal in the next 1 or 2 months, but more hopeful towards the end of this calendar year.
Okay.
So by December 2026, maybe something will get inked. But as of now, the only bottleneck is not really the trade negotiations, which I've
Yeah.
been told have been concluded,
Yeah.
but it's actually the Russia-Ukraine war and the fallout of that and the implications of India buying Russian oil or not buying
Right.
Russian oil, which is
Right.
holding up the deal.
Okay, so of course you've extended the timeline. There were at least some reports coming in that by March we may have the bilateral trade agreement signed, but you're saying potentially the trade agreement could be pushed to December of 2026. Now, Srinath, play the contrarian here and help us understand that what were India's red lines? Of course, there was agriculture, there was the MSME sector, and we are pretty much still very certain we don't want to open our farm sector to US crops, to soybean, to corn, to GM foods. And at the same time, we want to protect the interests of not just our farmers, but also our MSME sector, the textiles trade, the leather trade, the gems and jewelry trade. We want to protect those. But do you think now that you're looking at it in 2026, are we in a position to still protect those sectors, given that US continues to be our largest trading partner?
Well, Kartik, there I think the challenge where I have a slight discomfort with the term bilateral trade. I
Okay.
mean, what is bilateral anymore? I mean, I think this is a stance US has clearly shown that
It's a
not
unilateral trade agreement, you're saying?
It is unilateral and they want it in a certain way.
Yeah.
And especially after imposing the Trump tariffs for so long now.
Right.
And number two, I think the reality is US would want India to also open more doors to all things digital. Because it's one of the largest consumption market, and all things digital also have a segue into the financial services business. If you look at it, 85% of all our payments flow through the top three payment companies, which are owned by American entities. So the reality is US is going to want a far dominant picture, not just only for now, so transactional for now, but from the long term, they want to probably India to be seen as a larger colony. And that's a worry about anything that is bilateral. While we would want to protect whatever we are saying, we still have to build our capabilities around, let's say, digital sovereignty. And I think we are going to keep balancing this. So to come back to your question, I don't think anything is bilateral and probably it's going to play itself out. Just a case in point, last week, when the US awarded its own official for having brokered peace between India and Pakistan, it can't get sillier than that, despite India's denial so long. And yet it is doing it. I think these are all signals that US is saying, I'm going to be in my own voice, illusional voice or echo chamber, so to speak.
Right.
And I'm going to rub it in. And I think how Indian team kind of stays silent with its demeanor and calmness, I think to tolerate all this and overcome and get to a deal, I think that is what is going to be a test of our patience.
That's right, and I think the patience has been tested for 1 year and counting already. So it's a matter of how long before patience for the Indian negotiating team also runs out. But let's switch over now from January to the month of February. A lot of events. February was a rich event month. Of course, domestically, India presented its Union Budget 2025 and zero tax for income up to 12 lakh rupees. That was a major tax reform. There was another one to follow much later, announced in August and then implemented in September. We'll come to that when we arrive at those months. But specifically in the Indian context, I think India's Union Budget 2025, from boosting consumption and increasing the income in the hands of the people, the real income in the hands of the people, was something that the government had hoped is going to give a massive fillip to the Indian economy. Mitali, looking at, and I want to come to the economist in you. I don't really want to follow the same sequence of going one by one, but I want to really, get the economist in you to tell us very honestly, dispassionately, this income tax relief given to the middle class, did it spur demand and consumption the way it was expected to?
No, absolutely, Kartik. I think, at that time when this was announced, it was not fully unexpected because there were a lot of pressures on the consumption side of the economy. We were seeing that there is a need to push consumption. And there was also a need to recognize that the middle class really needed a fillip at that point. And I think this was one of the simplest measures. Actually, this measure really worked if you look at the last 1 year's data, because the number of tax filings has now gone up to almost 7.73 crores. so many more individuals coming forward and actually filing their taxes since this new regime came into place, and they can now choose to, move away from the old regime, which had a number of exemptions and was very complicated, to this very simple new regime, zero tax up to 12 lakhs, no need to file, 10 different exemptions, just, avail zero tax up to 12 lakhs and make your life really simple. I think this is also important for young people, because young people who are now getting into actually getting into the workforce and getting into tax filings, etc., for the first time in their life, for them, they're finding, oh, actually, we have a lot more disposable income. And another sector which has really benefited, and I've had consultations with so many of them, is the startup sector, because that's where the low income, high caliber young people are employed, and they can actually pay them a bit, say the same, but it helps in improving the income and take home of the employee.
No doubt about that. But again, I think another feature that the budget highlighted was the manufacturing fillip, and that manufacturing fillip was set to create more manufacturing jobs. We haven't really seen too much of that. But like I told you, 25 events, so we'll have to move a little faster. So Barnik, I'll come to you with another event which came into being on the 1st of February, and this was Trump's first tirade of tariffs, and these were tariffs on Mexico, Canada and China. Our assumption at that time was, and I don't know if we were right in assuming that or not, but our assumption then was that the tariff war is singularly targeted towards China to prevent China's hegemony in the overall G2, which eventually it ended up being called as. But the trade war was, to our assumption, then targeted at China, and then Mexico, of course, partly because of the fentanyl trade. But we've seen that China did not sort of relent, and in fact China sort of added its own reciprocal tariffs, and that entire China narrative got washed out over time when Trump eventually had to withdraw.
Yeah, so I think the biggest implication of the 1st February tariffs is that Trump was not afraid to go after friends. Canada and Mexico are actually the closest allies of the US.
Yeah.
In fact, the last trade deal which replaced NAFTA, which was the USMCA, was actually signed under Trump 1.
Absolutely.
And here was Trump tearing up his own trade agreement, and again, conveniently blaming the former President Biden about the trade, and going after Mexico and Canada. And then obviously he went after China. Now, if you look at, again, with virtue of hindsight in 2025, the big playbook which China has adopted in responding to the US trade sanctions have been the most aggressive and actually have been the most fruitful, because the Americans have actually backed off, right? If you look at today, where we stand in 2026, the net tariffs on China between the US and China are around 30 to 32%. This is very similar to the long-term rate. And despite all of the saber rattling and all of the threats over the last 12 months towards China, in fact, China has forced the Americans to back down. But again, the other important message which we as Indians should have taken note of at that time was that Trump was not afraid to go after friends, right? Which we also found out to our detriment a few months later.
Absolutely. Okay, so Srinath, let's move on to the next event in February. Remember, Feb has been a busy month, Feb 2025. So Feb 9th, remember that that famous AI-generated video that emerged where Trump called Gaza the Riviera of the Middle East, and the idea then was that, hey, who's going to rebuild Gaza, and is the vested interest of the US administration in ending the war in Gaza primarily targeted towards it becoming a tourism capital, a real estate hub, and we haven't really seen anything beyond that AI video really come through in terms of land acquisition or sort of any overtures, so to speak, of the US wanting to grab land in Gaza.
See, I think I see it slightly cynically. I mean, there have been a lot of test balloons that, President Trump's administration has kind of blown up and kind of waited for the action. And it is also no different on the other extreme end of their own PR machinery, talking about solving global crises and so on and so forth. And in the middle, if the president and his family have benefited personally from the real estate empire, so to speak, as well as other, we have seen the deal with Pakistan and the crypto empire that they're trying to create. So I think all of these have to be taken with a pinch of salt, saying that unless the concerned stakeholders are involved in any such conversations, I think all of these are great ideas from outside. It's no different from, with all respects to management consultants, including me, it's all great to come with a great PowerPoint presentation and blow up ideas, but the reality is, will the stakeholders bite? I think that is how I see this.
All right. Okay, so let's stick to the month of February and fast forward to Feb 13th and Feb 28th. Let's begin first with Feb 13th, which is when Prime Minister Modi met US President Donald Trump at the White House. Now, of course, we had visuals of those and we had all of you talking with us that day that here is a deal in the making and here is India sort of, its ascent at the global high table being acknowledged. There were also shots, I remember back then, visuals coming in of Donald Trump holding the chair for Prime Minister Modi to sit on when he was signing that visitor's book at the White House. And then, of course, a completely contrasting visuals came on Feb 28th, because Feb 28th was when Donald Trump met Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. And remember those visuals, the kind of contrast that we saw, that here you had a very, very formal, intimate sort of a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump, and cut to a completely rowdy encounter, if I can call it that, between Trump and Zelensky, with Trump and J.D. Vance literally ganging up against Zelensky, who had come over as a guest to the White House. So talk to us, Barnik, about this sort of difference in approach and the fact that did Trump want to really show that he has the upper hand and it is going to be his way or the highway when it comes to getting Zelensky to acknowledge the role of the United States in helping it with its war, which had already been running for almost 3 years, and the fact that Zelensky did not really have a thank you message when he entered White House?
No, I think what has been very frustrating for the president and his administration is that if you remember, before the Feb 28th meeting, Trump himself had publicly stated what he believed would be the settlement of the Ukrainian war, which actually included significant concession of land on behalf of the Ukrainians to the Russians, and no firm security guarantee to Ukraine either from NATO or the US. And these actually have been called as Russian talking points echoed by an American president, which, by the way, Trump had put as his stake in the ground on what peace would look like. And to be fair, when President Zelensky walked into the White House holding the Ukrainian stance, which are quite contrary to giving up significant tracts of land, particularly in eastern Ukraine, to the Russians, or even walking away from any such settlement without a security guarantee, I think obviously there's a difference of opinion. I think the entire optics of that meeting was, for the first time, Trump, who's very used to obsequious, I would say, dignitaries fawning over him. I think President Zelensky did not understand the playbook of dealing with Trump 2.0. I think he figured out that playbook later when he came next time with some awards and some gifts.
As recent as last week in Florida.
Yes. So I think President Zelensky was a little unaware of the playbook. He probably was thinking this is a traditional American president like President Biden, where you come and discuss policy and get away with it. But again, obviously the optics were terrible. But I think all of it is around the frustration of the administration to end the war. If you remember, after his election or during his election, President Trump had mentioned that he would end the war even before he took office. And we are now 1 year out from him assuming office, or nearly 1 year out from him assuming office.
And 9 months out from that meeting, 28th February to 1st of Jan, we are 9 months off from that meeting itself. 10 months almost done with that meeting, the first meeting. But of course, I mean, the playbook, I think, has been well read and well internalized by Zelensky. Now, coming back to our calendar, well, March was, some would say, an easier month. You didn't really have too many landmark events. 4th March, you remember, Donald Trump had told US Congress that America is back. And I remember Drill Baby Drill being one of those landmark moments that got echoed again. And then, of course, another, not a geopolitical, geoeconomic event, but of course, who can forget the March 9th India win at the ICC Champions Trophy. But let's quickly cut to April. And this is where the action actually began. It was a new financial year for India and for many other countries. But April 2nd, Liberation Day, Trump announces tariffs and calls them reciprocal tariffs worldwide. I remember him holding that plaque with all the country names and the tariff amount, the percentage written right ahead of it. And that was pretty much the start of what we sort of happen to understand as the playbook for the Trump presidency, if I can borrow that phrase from Barnik. And this is how it was going to be done. This is how business would be done, because Trump is a negotiator, Trump is a businessman, and Trump wanted the world to see in black and white that here is how my policy is going to work. And cut to 2 days later, China retaliates and China says, hey, guess what? You're not the only bully in the room and you've met your match in me. And China retaliates with fresh tariffs on US goods. And then cut to April 7th. So just look at the sequence. April 2nd, Trump tariffs. April 4th, China retaliates. April 7th, the European Union proposes 25% retaliatory tariffs on US imports. And April 7th also happens to be that day when the Indian markets had hit their 52-week low. So that first 1 week of April, Mitali, by all accounts, was something that nobody had really expected. We knew tariffs are a bad word. We knew it's going to hurt us. We didn't know how to sort of, retaliate, not retaliate, wait for some sort of clamor to die down. But our markets didn't take it well, and India never really retaliated. India exercised what some people called restraint and absolute diplomacy at play. When you look at it in the rearview mirror, a good strategy, or do you think India could have potentially been a little more aggressive?
So I think, Kartik, first of all, when you were introducing, you said that Trump is a negotiator and a businessman. But I think on this day, for any economist, he came across as somebody who does not understand the basic principles of economics.
Yeah.
And he also came across as a bully, a global bully who's sort of saying, either you do business with the US my way or it's the highway. And literally both of those were not taken well by, I think, any economist worth their salt, because firstly these calculations were also completely incorrect, as many articles which were published after the 2nd of April showed that they were based on absolutely basically no data or proper calculation metrics at all. The methodology was totally flawed. And then on top of that, services were not taken into account in this entire trade, where we know that the US dominates the world in export of services. I mean, all IT services, most of the financial services, the end beneficiary is an American company. So, this entire attempt at reigniting economic colonialism was what was on display in this board, in my view.
Yep.
And I think India's strategy was absolutely spot on, because in this month, actually, our tariffs were far lower
Of
than
course.
many of the comparable countries.
True.
But it was only later in August, and I'm sure we'll speak about it when we come
Yeah.
to August, where the real blows
Absolutely.
came.
We will
So-
talk about those, but let's quickly fast forward to the other sort of calendar dates of the month of April. So we've spoken 2nd April, 4th April, 7th April, and now let's move to 9th of April. And this is when the US really decided to get the notches much higher and create more noise. So 104% US tariffs on China take effect on April 9th, and it's April 9th when Trump, for the first time, announces a 90-day tariff pause. And then we later realize that pauses is going to be the way forward as well. There's going to be threats, there's going to be tariff temper, but that temper is also going to have its own pauses. So April 9th is when the first 90-day pause was announced, and 2nd July is when tariffs were to take effect. But the same day, on April 9th, China played ball as well, and China raised tariffs to 125%. And that is the day when the S&P 500 actually posted its biggest gain since 2008, owing, of course, to the time difference between US and China. But I think we've spoken enough about tariffs, and there's going to be a lot more that we will talk about tariffs. But I want to take a quick break. But before that break, I think one headline and one date which is etched very closely in the hearts of every Indian, every single Indian heart beating today, remembers the date of April 22nd. And April 22nd was that dastardly, deadly terror attack in Jammu and Kashmir. I'm talking, of course, about Pahalgam, where we had, of course, the armed terrorists armed to the teeth, opening fire and killing innocent Indians. Well, April 22nd, obviously a dark day, but India's response, Operation Sindoor, that ensued in the month of May. India's show of strength really came after that dastardly 22nd April terror attack at Pahalgam, and India's response in the month of May is our next calendar event for the year 2025. Now remember, May 7th is when India launched Operation Sindoor, and that was India's definitive answer to Pakistan-induced terror in India. Now, May 10th is when India and Pakistan announced the ceasefire. But this 3-day, almost a 4-day, some call it skirmish, some call it India's terror outfit attack, and of course, Indian Air Force and Indian Armed Forces going ahead and eventually taking on the military posts as well as bombarding airfields in Pakistan. India pretty much saying that terror and water will not run together. Remember the Indus Water Treaty. India saying that cricket and blood will not flow together, and India making it very clear that every act of terror on Indian soil will be construed as an act of war. My guests Mitali, Nikore, Barnik Chitran Maitra and Srinath continue to be with me. Barnik, I want to get your views and talk to us first from a global perspective. We all know and we are all proud of what our armed forces displayed in those 4 operational days of Op Sindoor, which incidentally continues to be an ongoing operation. But India's response very well appreciated by Indian citizens. Globally, what was the reaction?
I think the global reaction to India's approach to Operation Sindoor was actually quite remarkably lauded by all quarters. First, in the intent of the precision of the strikes and who they went after, and then India's approach to not escalate the full skirmish into a full-blown war. In fact, after the initial Operation Sindoor operations on 7th, every single subsequent operation from the Indian side was only a retaliation to what the Pakistanis carried out on the Indian side. So again, and that also was measured retaliation and not an acceleration or escalation. And at the end of the day, by when it came to 10th, you have to note that it was the Pakistanis, whether or not from pressure from the Americans, that is still questionable even today, actually decided to call up the DGM on the Indian side to ask for a ceasefire. So again, I think India showed strength, India showed restraint, India showed that it's a serious power and cannot be trifled with easily. I think this sent important messages not only to the rest of the world, including our allies in Europe, UK, but also to our frenemy China, that India is serious and should be taken seriously instead of just being punched with 1,000 holes. And I think, as usual, I think there was a lot of appreciation from a lot of our allies, including the Americans, the Europeans, the British, the Australians, the Japanese, on the level of restraint and the precision with which the Indians went about it. And at the end of the day, I think the overall conventional warfare superiority our armed forces have over Pakistan shown through at the end of the day, right? And again, I think it's an more important message to not only our neighbor on the northwest, but also on our neighbor toward the northeast, right? That India is not to be trifled with.
Absolutely. So I think that message was absolutely loud and clear, and the precision strikes that the Indian armed forces made pretty much got Pakistan down to its knees. But Srinath, can we decisively contest once again that US President Donald Trump had absolutely no need to take credit for the cessation of firing? Let's not call it a ceasefire, but for the cessation of hostilities. Last count, I think it was 12 or 13 times, maybe more, that Donald Trump has mentioned his role in the India-Pakistan ceasefire. But the Indian side has been absolutely clear that the call came from Pakistan's DGMO and not with US intervention.
Yeah, I mean, Kartik, here I have to change the title of the popular English movie, Shall We Tell the President, to Who Will Tell the President? I mean, enough number of times India has taken a stand, and these continues, and the very fact that even last week they awarded somebody within their regime to having brokered that. So these are clear messages, but more importantly, I think we must also look at some of the serious strategic affairs theories that have been floating around. That US probably wanted to move away from questioning why did the arms that they had provided to Pakistan kind of fail in this entire one, because then that would have put a stop to their military-industrial complex. The potential arms sale that they could have done, those arms would have been affected. And that is why in their own interest, they wanted to call it off and claim first right of what they achieved without having actually done anything there. So I think it is important. Having said that, I think we have shown great grit and resilience, and too, I think tact. I think India has very tactfully not made it in your face kind of statements back.
Right.
And I think reading it or misreading it as weakness is, I think, a huge mistake. I mean, I
Absolutely.
think it is okay to be tactful and diplomatic. It doesn't make us any weaker. We are not
Right.
weak at all there.
Absolutely right. Okay, so let's move on now. That was the month of May, obviously defined by Sindoor, that every Indian citizen is proud of. But cut to June, and June 12th, a dark day in 2025 for India, because this is the day that the Air India Dreamliner crashed in Ahmedabad en route to Gatwick, London. And one miracle survivor. Who would have believed, looking at those visuals of the Air India Dreamline coming down just 32 seconds or so after takeoff, coming down, crashing into a residential area right in the city of Ahmedabad. And one miracle survivor. I think the unanswered question still is, what went wrong with the aircraft? And it's been more than half a year, 7 months and counting, where we still don't have the concrete answers. So, Mitali, as far as air crashes go, I understand this may be outside of your area of expertise, but just to get a view from you here, as far as air crashes go, do you think there is enough capital at play here to try and absolve Boeing of its potential follies, or do you think it's fine air crash investigations take that much time?
So I think, Kartik, this is also quite emotional for me to comment on, because I actually visited the crash site this year.
Okay.
I was actually there because it's a slum area, and we're working with some of the women in the community. And they also actually suffered, a lot of consequences of this crash, because it was
Yeah.
literally in their backyard when it happened. And at the end of the day, I mean, what we are seeing in the global airline market as a consequence of this crash is that Boeing has sort of lost its position very clearly as the provider of choice, even amongst American airlines. We are seeing a lot more orders going towards Airbus. We're seeing, of course, a lot more focus on airline safety. We're seeing, regulators across the world, up their air crash safety standards. We're seeing, this sort of a movement, and that, as someone who travels frequently or by air, that's actually very heartening. But I do believe that, the Indian public and everybody who uses Air India is owed an explanation of what
Yes.
happened. And
Absolutely.
and I do think that while it may take time, but it is critical that especially the families of all the victims,
Yeah.
they also need closure, and that can't come until
Absolutely.
the investigation is complete.
A fair, transparent, honest, detailed, nuanced investigation, leaving absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind on exactly what went wrong on that ill-fated Air India Dreamliner that went down in Ahmedabad. Let's move forward now. Of course, a tragic event, and our condolences continue to be with the families of the victims of that air crash. But moving on now, June 13th, and that is when Israel starts Operation Rising Lion and strikes Iranian nuclear targets. And cut to exactly 8 days later, June 21st, when the US B-2 bombers fly from the US all the way into Iran, and US strikes Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, Srinath, this is US going literally out of the way to support one ally in the war, and that ally is Israel. Is there some sort of a divergence from what we saw US do with, let's say, Mexico and Canada that we spoke about earlier? Strong allies, but nothing doing. I'm not here as a friend, I'm here to do business, versus Israel and Iran, and supporting Israel and going and striking Iran and saying, hey, guess what? I'm not here only to do business, I'm here as your friend.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting if you look at the history of Israel and Iran. Until the mid 70s, they were not this hostile to each other. They were okay, they were friends. And this time, I think it's also, is it coincidental that in April, sometime around April, Iran announced signaling production of rare earth minerals,
Yeah.
which potentially is the third largest in the world. And then within 2 months, you have this happening, and US kind of getting into that entire fray. So to me, this is also the usual colonization symbol. saying that, hey, you know what, I want a share of pie of those rare earth minerals, because on one end of the spectrum, US was levying tariffs, especially what we all assumed as against China, but then became rest of the world. And then also wanting to go and attack Iran. And also, if you look at it, Israel, just a couple of days ago, the Israeli head of state is back in the US for conversation. So this is not over. I think this is all conversation around, probably in the sense, political land grab, so to speak.
So, of course, how the US-Israel partnership plays out into the future. Is it going to be minerals or is it going to be pure friendship as at play is something that we will have to see how that unfolds in 2026. But moving on from June to the month of July, and a lot happened in July, like a lot happened in April, like a lot happened in February. So in the month of July, 7 July, US announces 25% tariff on Japan and South Korea. And this is where the action actually begins to heat up. A day later, July 8th, Trump warns BRICS nations of additional 10% tariffs. Now, cut to less than a week later, July 14th, US announces the Patriot missiles for Ukraine, which continues to be a thorny issue for Russia even today. And a few days later, July 22nd, the first of the trade deals get announced. US-Japan trade deal announced. Tariffs are slashed from 25% to 15%. Not out of any goodwill, but because Japan commits $550 billion of investment in the US. Cut to exactly 8 days later, India has made no investment decisions for the US, and India has not reacted the way other countries have reacted. So July 30th, there is a 25% tariff on Indian imports. Remember, this is exactly 1% lower than the 26% tariff which was announced on Liberation Day, which was the 2nd of April. So now India is faced with a 25% tariff, but that's not the worst of it. There's a lot more which is going to come on the tariff front, and we will come to that in the month of August. Now, remember, August begins with the 6th of August, where the US announces 100% tariff on semiconductor chips. Now, remember, this was something which was kept outside of the ambit of tariffs. But on the very same day, less than a week after reducing the 26% tariff to 25% tariff on India, US announces on August 6th an additional 25% tariff on Indian goods for India importing Russian oil, taking up India's total tariff to 50%. Barnik, 50% too steep. Some were calling it sanctions back then. Despite that, India continued, at least until November, we know for sure, India continued buying Russian oil. And the kind of bonhomie that we saw between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi during Putin's visit to New Delhi in the first week of December showed that India continued to be fairly unrattled by this 50% tariff. However, diplomatically urging US to reduce the tariff, and especially that 25% tariff, after the real sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft were imposed when India stopped buying Russian oil. And latest reports in December show that India is again buying Russian oil, but not from these two sanctioned firms, but from other smaller crude production firms.
Yeah, so I think the 25% additional sanctions were clearly punitive and were clearly sent as a way to appease the Russia hawks inside the administration, and also the Europeans who were complaining about favorable treatment meted out to the Indians, particularly with no punitive sanctions on the oil. I think let's look at from an Indian point of view at the 50-51% level. India has not reacted for many reasons. I think one, if you look at the tariffs, there are in typical Trump style, there are some exemptions. Right? For example, there are exemptions for electronics, smartphones. I think later there was an exemption for pharma goods also. So for our full tariff basket, the 50% doesn't apply. Where it hurts us most is actually labor-intensive industries like textile exports and gems. So there is an impact. But on the other side, there is also an economic benefit of buying Russian oil, which at its peak was around 15-16% cheaper than the global crude prices. Now, over the July to September quarter, the difference between the Russian crude and the global crude prices
Had narrowed considerably.
narrowed to $3.5, $4. At $4 a barrel, it doesn't make economic sense for India to buy Russian oil because that gets covered in the logistics of the insurance costs, right?
Right.
So I think India has been playing a reasonably tight economic game, right, where they're walking a tightrope on two things. On one dimension, balancing economic interests and strategic interests for India, and secondly, also ensuring that we maintain equidistance and equally friendly ties with not only the US but also with Russia. So you have to note that unlike a lot of other countries, India has long civilizational ties with Russia, as was then evidenced by President Putin's visit to India a few weeks back. So I think India has always been walking a tightrope. I think the calculus done by the mandarins in Delhi that at that time was Trump, in his classic style, would withdraw the tariffs or pause it, which he unfortunately didn't. And even if there is an impact on India, the impact is not that much when compared to the benefit of Russian oil or the benefit of Russian friendship in general. Because if you look at the kind of things which we'll cover in the story later of what we signed with the Russian president when he was here, I think in hindsight and on balance, I think it's a cost the Indian administration was willing to take.
Right.
That being said, I think there's a clear signal from the Americans that this is a time of transactional diplomacy, and nothing stops India from being driven into the hands of Russia and China. So the
Yeah.
entire SCO visuals of the
Yes.
famous hug between the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi
Yes.
and President Putin,
Yes.
again, was played very prominently on American media. So again, I think India has been playing its game, which I think is very sensible and aligned with our economic and strategic interests. So I wouldn't fault the Indians for what they are doing, but again, remember, unfortunately, that the India-US trade deal has got hyphenated with the Russia-Ukraine war, and unless President Trump can claim some sort of a near-term victory, as he has claimed with several other things,
Yeah.
I don't think that trade deal will be pushed through in a hurry.
All right. Of course, we will have to see whether that hyphenation gets dehyphenated and whether the trade deal will hopefully at least be stitched in the calendar year 2026, like you mentioned, even if not in the financial year FY26. But cutting across now to August 15th, and of course that iconic speech by Prime Minister Narendra Modi from the Red Fort, where he pitches once again for self-reliance and hints at, in fact, more than hints at GST 2.0, GST rationalization, GST reforms, India's second tax reform in the same calendar year. Remember, 1st Feb was the budget, direct income tax reforms, and then August 15th is when GST rationalization gets announced, and that gets implemented on September 22nd. Mitali, many had argued that the September 22nd rollout and eventually the consumption boost, which now becomes a double sort of engine with the income tax relief and now the GST relief, is largely targeted at India trying to offset the tariffs imposed by the US. But as the story played out, it seemed that the two pretty much seemed to be separate entities and not really at crossroads with each other. And India's own consumption, and we will of course get data for the October, November, December quarter later in the month of Jan, but it seems that India's consumption story, and we saw the numbers of cars getting sold and the number of white goods getting bought, that was something that was the much needed fillip for the Indian consumption story, wasn't it?
Absolutely, Kartik. I mean, if you think about it, firstly, I just want to say India navigated the entire period post these tariff measures in a very exemplary manner, because at the end of the day, the government of India was faced with a number of challenges. It was faced with the challenge of a non-cooperative ally, who was asking for opening up our agricultural markets in a manner that no developing country can be ready for. And of course we didn't have that wherewithal, and we still probably don't have the wherewithal to bring in those kind of soya bean dumping into the Indian agricultural market. But at the same time, to then use the GST as a lever and say, there is no need for these kind of geopolitical developments that are taking place in the global economy to dampen the spirit of a fast growing Indian economy and to de-link the two. That was the measure of the GST announcements, and the fact that it was branded also as a GST Bachat Utsav. It was
Right.
brought in at
Exactly.
a time
With
at
the
the time
festive
of
season
Diwali.
and the kind of discounts which would in any case be
Exactly.
on offer. Absolutely. 25 stories that define 2025 and potentially a path pathway to the world that we live in now and would potentially live in the future as well. And talking about the future, well, one trend which was unmissable across 2025 was the rise and rise and rise and more rise of artificial intelligence. And don't take my word for it. Take the valuation of the largest chip maker, NVIDIA, on the 29th of October. That's right, 29th October is when NVIDIA became the world's first $5 trillion company. That's right. But it did correct, however, subsequently. But the fact that it became a company that touched $5 trillion signified the kind of appetite for artificial intelligence. And soon thereafter, there was a new buzzword which was called the AI bubble, and many predicting that the AI bubble would likely burst very soon. So, Srinath, AI bubble or AI boom, which side of the pendulum are you on?
AI FOMO for sure.
Okay.
I think we are in the
Your
midst of
FOMO
that
or
in some,
FOMO for the rest of them?
industry
Because I'm
segment.
pretty sure you are quite okay with your AI skills.
Oh, absolutely. I think see, AI is not new. In fact, it has become a retail term in the last 2 years, especially after ChatGPT. Otherwise, AI
Yeah.
has been used in most of the devices, and
Yeah.
let's say banking sector has been using it for quite some time.
Right.
But it became almost household name, and everybody suddenly became a poet and
Generative
a
AI.
writer and a researcher. And you go to LinkedIn and you realize how AI is actually kind of overtaken human cognition, human thinking capabilities. And I think that's a fear that we're going to have. But again, history of technology has also told us a lot of hubris that have happened, right? I don't know whether you remember, Kartik, there was a handheld device called Palm, a brand called Palm. And at one point, its market cap was valued more than the sum of the next 4 technology companies, including Microsoft and others. And Palm just kind of faded away. So I think while this AI, as we think, is a very fast journey, I think the reality is going to be how are we going to regulate and how are we going to pick it up. NVIDIA, great. And that is why we're also seeing the chip wars, right? I mean, US kind of banned China from using it in 2015, and China developed its own technology. China in the last 7 to 8 years has poured about $220 billion in developing AI. And I think that's the nature. I don't know if many of our viewers will remember, a week before President Biden left office and President Trump took over, there was a small AI regulation that they brought in where they classified India and China as tier 3 nation for them, which meant that India and China would have to take prior explicit approval to buy any chips or any American companies wanting to even sell algorithm to them. And I think that's the kind of wars we are going to see. So to me, NVIDIA or not, I think AI wars are already amidst us. And in that entire journey, can we all stay sane, and what is being human? Can we hold on to it?
Okay, and another event, I mean, we were talking about NVIDIA touching 5 trillion on October 29, but another event in October was October 1st. And this is when the US government went into shutdown, and that shutdown lasted until November 12th, which is when Trump signed a bill ending this historic US government shutdown. A lot of chaos in the US, a lot of data went unnoticed and unregistered, unaccounted for. You had flight disruptions, ATC disruptions and whatnot. But moving on and staying, in fact, with the month of November, November 20th is when the first formal, one could call it, the peace plan for the Russia-Ukraine war was drafted. This was the 28-point Ukraine peace plan, which many argued was heavily favoring Russia. Well, we saw a sort of repeat of that and a slight edit of that with the 20-point peace program that Ukraine offered in the last week of December in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. But November was also marked by another tragic event, and November 26th was Hong Kong's deadliest fire in decades that killed over 150 people. Well, let's move on from that horrific Hong Kong deadly fire to the month of December. And December 1st, the Indian markets actually hit their 52-week high. That's right. The September highs of 2024 more than evaporated, elapsed, and Indian markets hit their 52-week high on December 1st. But immediately thereafter, December 2nd is when a major disruption happened in the Indian skies, and talking about the IndiGo crisis. And I'm sure all of us have suffered on account of those 10-odd days where there was absolute madness, absolute chaos at airports across the country because the country's largest air carrier, IndiGo, was unable to schedule flights, giving to the flight duty limitation program of the government. Barnik, obviously this is something which we've discussed multiple times, but the fact that the Indian aviation market is a strong duopoly, and with a 64-62% market share that IndiGo enjoys, one would argue it's pretty much monopolistic, even though technically it might be a duopoly. What can India do apart from, just giving more licenses? What can India do to sort of ease off this monopolistic behavior of IndiGo?
So I think let's be clear that the duopoly or the monopolies created in some of these sectors have often been deliberate and have been instruments of state policy across multiple sectors over the last 10 years. So again, let's be clear that if you have to blame someone, I think let us also blame the current administration for getting us into this mess where across several sectors we have strong monopolies or strong duopolies. I think the solution is manifold. I think in addition to granting more licenses, which there are rumors that there may be 3 more regional airlines which may be given the green signal soon. I think India has to do more in terms of ensuring that we are regulating monopolistic behavior and regulating monopolistic players. I think some of the things, though, it's very hard to imagine as a capitalist norms like fare caps and all of that, right? Which I think are sensible instruments of policy, particularly when you have a monopoly or a duopoly around, are something which the regulator should seriously evaluate. In addition to that, I think the regulator should be very strict in terms of adherence to norms. Let us be clear why the IndiGo crisis happened. The IndiGo crisis happened because IndiGo brazenly was flouting crew safety norms in terms of their rest period. And while they were coming back to what was mandated DGCA norms, which was, by the way, followed by all of the industry.
Absolutely. IndiGo just threw its hands in the air and said, hey, we don't have enough pilots and there's going to be a problem and we can't fly our schedules. Absolutely untenable. But obviously, I mean, the IndiGo crisis was a big story, Barnik, but there were another 2 big stories that came from Australia just 4 days apart, 5 days apart. December 10th is when Australia banned social media for children under 16 years of age. And just as the world was beginning to celebrate that and applaud the sort of progressive policy decision by Australia, December 14th was that horrific Sydney terror attack at Bondi Beach, which killed 16 people. But I think a lot more people are dying here in India thanks to air pollution, and that is what I want to leave this with. Mitali, we were talking just before we started rolling this show that how we've become potentially accustomed to high AQI levels living in Delhi NCR. Well, Barnik lives in Bombay, I beg your pardon, Srinath lives in Bombay. Barnik is a globetrotter. He doesn't spend as much time in Delhi NCR as you and I do, but talking specifically about Delhi pollution, and 28th December, pretty much the fag end of the year, recorded the worst air quality AQI levels, breaching the 800 levels. We are completely out of time, but I really want your view on this, Mitali. Is there something, we know there's an economic cost, but economics aside, there is a cost of life and health, which some would say is priceless. Is there a solution? Give me your take in 30 seconds.
I think, Kartik, there is a solution, and that solution is for the Prime Minister's office to take this very seriously, to launch a national clean air mission, which actually exists on paper, but to revive it and to work with every state. Because I know we are talking about Delhi, but I have been visiting so many cities across the country, and the AQI is above 300 in many of them. So, honestly, and we need to stop fooling ourselves with the way we are measuring pollution. I mean, to say that, we're going to stop the AQI measurement at 500 and we're going to, sprinkle water on the AQI monitors. I mean, this all has to stop. Nobody is fooling anyone. It's time for the Prime Minister's office to take leadership on this issue and to solve it once and for all with interstate coordination.
Absolutely. And the buck has to stop somewhere. And if that buck has to stop at the highest office in this country, then so be it. And that accountability must be executed. We hope in 2026. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for, Barnik. I know we wanted to discuss Putin's visit to India, but I think we spoke enough of that with you, with Mitali and with Srinath on the day that Putin was here. So to all our viewers, do look up our YouTube channel and watch that extensive coverage that we did on Putin's visit to India. But with that, it is a wrap on this first sort of edition of the year gone by and the start of 2026 right here on News 9. Thank you so much for tuning in, and here's wishing all our guests and all our viewers a very happy 2026.
This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News 9, English news as it should be.